So this
Catholic Christian. Our purpose here tonight is to begin to set the record straight about the contributions that Africans made to what we call modern civilization. As the title of our show implies, Stolen Legacy is about some of the advancements made that were in fact stolen from their African creators.
The wisdom, the foundation of wisdom, it came from Kemet. They recognized that. So in fact, it was not stolen legacy. No. They stole, in antiquity, they recognized. But when we start slavery, colonization, for 13th century, 14th century, 15th century, they changed the historiography. The way of writing history changed completely. How you can say, I learn from you and make you slave? It makes no sense. You are my master and make you slave now. I don't recognize that. I must destroy your mind and destroy my own mind too. Both. Yes. This is one of them too. One of the spent five years in Kemet studying. They call the father of atomist theory. He spent five years in Kemet studying their physics and what they call nature. Next, all of them systematically. I give picture in the book with detail. All of them. This one is a Plato himself. Plato has maybe 24 dialogues. In 12 of them, he gives a lot of detail concerning Kemet, a lot. You read any kind of information you want on Kemet is a Plato.
It's in the documents of the church. And it's in the writing of the church. And was it not Pope Melchizedek, the three African popes of the Roman Catholic Church, Melchizedek, Victor III, and the other one,
Galatius. Pope Galatius.
Galatius. We have them there. Now, these are church documents. But remember, when there came a time in 1506, after we lost power in Spain, the Africans ruled Spain from 711. We were calling ourselves Moors, M-A-U-E-R-S, then M-O-O-R-S. From 711 until 1485, 774 years, when we built and brought into Europe the university system, building the University of Salamanca, S-A-L-A-M-A-N-C-A in Spain, a copy of the University of Genève from ancient Ghana, which was equally a copy of the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which the French later called Timbuktu. Now, look, if you want to read it, read Stanley Lane Poole's The Moors in Spain, written in 1887, or Alejandro Macaziza. Read his book in Spanish, The Moors in Spain, and said that even the bath was introduced by those Africans.
You said the bra was introduced by...
The bath was reintroduced because Rome had a bath before, but they stopped because of not understanding the Christian doctrine that the Europeans had embraced. They stopped for over 1,000 years from taking baths. As a matter of fact, Doc like to make mockery of the fact that the Queen Victoria of England boasting of herself being the cleanest woman in all of Europe, taking 1 bath per month.
To Egypt until 640. The first non-African people came to Egypt, otherwise called the Hyksos, in 1675 BC. The Africans there were already in the 13th dynasty period. They had built every pyramid you saw there before. They had done the S-turn in the Nile. They built every one of the major temples that had already been built, including the Grand Lodge of Luxor. The first European to come there did not arrive until the Greeks arrived with Alexander II, the son of Philip of Macedonia.
Look, I'm a college graduate. I never heard all this stuff before.
Because they didn't intend to teach you that. They can't tell you that you're inferior and teach you that you taught Europe. The first Europeans to be civilized by the Africans were the Greeks. When you heard of Homer, the first European to have written anything, you couldn't miss that. They said that Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And that was not until 833 BC. The Africans had already, in 255,000 at the Tassili Mountain, they had the Sibyllian period, first, second, and third, the pre-dynastic period, all the way up. The Africans had produced men like this, Imhotep, the multi-genius that designed the step pyramid of Saqqara. the first man to be a physician, that even Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine, is giving him credit and call him the god of medicine. The Greeks changed his name from Imhotep to Aesculapius. There he is. There he is. Went to Egypt to school.
As a matter of fact, the Egyptians said Homo is Egyptian, not Greek.
That's right. It's only the Europeans said that. The Westerners now said that he was. But let us go back. Remember that Homer himself said in the Odyssey what? That the gods Zeus and Apollo, Europe's first gods, came from Ethiopia. Go read it, and I didn't write it. He wrote it. Thales, from Thales down to Socrates, and Socrates down to Aristotle, which they call the pre-Socratic philosophers and the post-Socratic philosophers. Each and every one, including Plato, who spent 15 years in Egypt receiving their education.
You're saying Plato was educated in Egypt?
15 years.
Ben, what do you have to say about the missionary position? I should say the practice of missionaries.
Well, I don't have anything good to say, so I could make it by that one statement. And I don't think anyone who knows their African history could compliment the missionaries. First thing is that the assumption is made by Europeans, Billy Graham and others, and I noticed that he's getting his lumps now, for having the courage to say that somebody has practiced Christianity, but I don't know what he meant by that either. But number one, Christianity started in Africa at a place called Alexandria with two people, Pantheus and Boetius. It spread across the North African continent. There were 7 patriarchs, equivalent to the word pope, 27 bishops before it arrived in Europe. The Bible, however, the Old Testament, or the Torah, as it is called, speaks of chosen people. A God made a world full of people and select a handful to be the special ones. The Quran and Islam equally. The jihads were brought. Although Ben Hamid and Hadsat Kubadi Ben Rabad taught Muhammad ibn Abdullah, who was illiterate in his own language, the fundamentals of the religions that the fundamentals upon which all three got their beginning, we were told, and still being told, that there is a holy land for us in Palestine or Jerusalem. There's a holy land for us in Bethlehem. There's a holy land for us in Mecca, but not a single piece of holy land in the 13.8 million square miles of African territory. I went and volunteered, went to Panama to a segregated army where I couldn't go on the bus with the American people, and in Panama I went to Panamanians I could go among. I came to Newport News, Virginia in the service and couldn't go on the ferry. They had a line called nigger, the nigger officers and the white officers. That happened to me. And do you know it was a German soldier that I was guarding, officer, that asked me, nigger, he says, exact word he said to me, nigger officer, do you know that when this is over, I'm coming to America and be your boss? And then I started for the first time to get some sense, although I had been segregated in Panama and so forth, and I didn't even recognize I was being segregated in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. I didn't even realize it. I thought that everything was, as they say, hunky-dory down there. But, you know, because of what he said.
Hunky-dory, H-U-N-K-Y.
That was right. The expression. Right. That means real good. And I was a perfect fool and didn't know it. I used the term Negro there, and all of them shooting up the indigenous people, and I used to say, hey, there's a savage coming, shoot them Tomix. And then with the African, I'd say, oh, look at them savage, Tarzan is coming. And I'm hoping for Tarzan, and Tarzan hollering Ungawa. And one thing, I didn't know that Ungawa meant doo-doo, because every time Tarzan said Ungawa, and when I found out that Ungawa meant doo-doo, I said, Ungawa Tarzan. I used to have fun then. But
all right, let's move forward.
Now, with man coming out of this period, we see him going down the Nile, and the reason we're using the Nile as the example in that the oldest records of human behavior, where the man left his record, has been found in that specific area. Based upon anthropological and archaeological finding, there have been a very old period, for example, in Southern Africa, in Swaziland,
there is a 43,000-year-old iron mine found there. So that would indicate, we're talking about 43,000 years, meaning that since we're dealing with historical record, it matches most of the things that we find along the line, and more specifically in Egypt, where we go back to the Sibyllian period. The Sibyllian, the first and second period in Egypt will be about 125,000 BC. Back to 300,000 BC. The second period would be 125,000 to 25,000. So in between here, that mine was being used, meaning then that the Africans in the southernmost tip of Africa, otherwise then called Monomotapa, the earliest name when the Europeans came, it was called that, were involved and engaged in iron mining at a time when it wasn't so done in Egypt, because the civilization or high cultures traveled down to Egypt from the central part of Africa.
His dream tomb out of stone.
Here's a close-up of that face. Haramaka, the face of the statue, 13 feet, 8 inches wide. It is the head of Heru, the son of the resurrected god, Asar. It's also important for us to understand the reality, as I heard someone mention in the audience, that it is no coincidence that this statue is missing its nose and its lips. We know specifically that in July of 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte came to Egypt in the first leg of his journey to conquer the world. He came to Egypt because he had always held this ancient civilization in very high regard. So Napoleon assumed that if he could conquer Egypt and rediscover some of the greatness of the ancient Egyptians, this would assist him in his quest to conquer the rest of the world. So then imagine Napoleon's surprise when he comes upon this statue of Haramaka, the statue which still today sits in a pit below ground level. And it was at that time in 1798 literally buried up to his neck in sand. And the only image that Napoleon saw staring down upon him was this 13-foot, 8-inch wide head of an African, of a brother. And Napoleon was unable to accept the historical reality that he was confronted with. He therefore instructed his soldiers to take the cannons and shoot the nose and the lips off of this statue. Napoleon is also responsible for giving us the statement that history is a lie agreed upon. And I submit to you all this evening, sisters and brothers, that when it comes to telling the history of the story of African people, the general consensus has been to lie, to say that you have no history, you have no culture. But if you are willing to do the homework, then you can pull the covers off of the lies. All right?
Djoser turned to his right-hand man, an architect of humble roots named Imhotep. Not only was Imhotep Djoser's chief architect, he was also treasurer, high priest, and vizier, a role roughly equivalent to prime minister. But it would be his groundbreaking work on Djoser's burial complex that would earn him immortal praise. Even the Romans, great engineers in their own right, would one day worship at his altar.
African history, 5,900 BC. We get a line of 9 pharaohs of Nubia. And then when we get to the 10th pharaoh of Nubia, we get the rise of the first pharaoh of Egypt, 5,660 BC to 5,598 BC. He reigned for 62 years.
His name was?
This particular person, okay, you can use what some people do. There's a tradition of writing African history using Greek names because the earliest documents are in Greek. In which case he becomes Pharaoh Menes. African name Pharaoh Mena or Pharaoh Name. And the reason why we've got 2 names is that there's a Horus name and there's a Set name. These are 2 of the ancient deities of ancient Egypt. Does that make sense? So I prefer to use Pharaoh Mena, first king of the first dynasty of ancient Egypt. Now, in a fair world, this face should be the most recognized face in human history. Everyone should know who this person is. Now, what do we know about this face? The portrait statue was dug up in 1920-odd by Sir Flinders Petrie, Englishman. Sir Flinders Petrie brought the statue, this portrait statue, brought it to London, where it is now housed in the University College London, the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, which is on Mallet Street, And when you go inside Mallet Street, you ask for the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, ask for catalogue number UC15989. That's what they'll show you. Which means that they've known this stuff since the 20s. And therefore, what they presented as Egyptology has essentially been a joke. And they've been laughing at us because they know they have this portrait. One more thing about this portrait, also ancestor of Mr. Michael Tyson.
Easy.
Everyone's thinking, who's Michael Tyson? Right, Pharaoh Binethris, Pharaoh of the second Egyptian dynasty. Now people are thinking, Robin, what's a dynasty? A line of kings belonging to the same royal family. So Mena plus 8 members of his family, a time period of nearly 300 years. That's dynasty 1. Does that make sense? Yeah. Right? This guy, Pharaoh Binethris, plus 11 members of his family, they ruled as dynasty 2. And then the dynasty 2 period is the beginnings of where the Egyptians start to build grand monuments. And the beginnings of the monument building is the last pharaoh of this guy's family. His name is Pharaoh Karsekemui. Then we move to dynasty 3, where we have Pharaoh Zosa and 5 members of his family ruling as dynasty 3. Then we have Pharaoh Khufu and 7 members of his family ruling as dynasty 4. Then we have Pharaoh Sahura and 9 members of his family, dynasty 5. And then we have Pharaoh Pepi and 6 members of his family, dynasty 6. That takes us from dynasty 1 to dynasty 6. This is what scholars call the Old Kingdom period. Now, I've just done it, I've just talked about it in less than 5 minutes. We've actually traversed 1,472 years of black history. Remember the pyramid texts. During this period, we have the world's first philosopher, Ptah Hotep. So in other words, during this period, this was the most amazing period in world history. Now, we could talk about details and so on, but I'm going to keep it real simple. Check him out. I'll just let that sink in. Right, so this is then the beginnings of black history. At this point, there are only 2 civilizations on Earth. Tarseti, the land of Set, and Kemet, the land of Egypt. Does that make sense? Yeah. There are no civilizations anywhere else. Right, the next great period begins with this guy, Pharaoh Mentuhotep II. Mentuhotep II is responsible for the second unification of Egypt that created what's called the Middle Kingdom. He's one of the pharaohs of the 11th dynasty. And what happens is he banishes his rivals, pulls together the 2 lands, and was then the next pharaoh to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, the Middle Kingdom is really interesting because it's during the Middle Kingdom that modern ideology, as we understand modern ideology today, was born. The idea that a government has a responsibility to look after its people, to feed its people, to clothe its people, to build, for example, we get buildings of apartments of 3,000 rooms, we get the draining of swamps, irrigation, all the things that a modern government does, they were dealing with it then. The detail is. Now, why this is really interesting is that this was built something like 3,500 BC. This particular part was built by Pharaoh Senusret I. And as you can see, yeah, I'm feeling that. Right now, here we have a line of sphinxes. And the sphinxes show Ares the ram. Ares the ram is sacred to the deity Amen. So we're starting off here, which is Karnak. We're going to follow the line of rams. And as we follow the line of rams, this is where we end up. It's a bit like we're starting off here, which is Karnak. We're following the road. We've got this double line of rams till we end up here. Now, essentially, we're moving 2 miles across the city of Karnak/Thebes. This city originally had a population of 1 million people. And then what you would have would be mansions along the edge of the city with 50 to 60 rooms. Yes? In other words, Cushites was living large. Now we're going to go to the other end of the complex, and here we are now. This is in Luxor. In other words, we've moved 2 miles away and we're still part of this temple complex. Now, why this is really, really interesting is that this is one of the largest examples of temple building built anywhere on earth by any group of people. Okay, now we're going to move into next year, and we're going to deal with some more civilizations in Africa. We're going to deal with what W.E.B. Du Bois calls Ethiopia, 650 BC. Another name for that same civilization is what we would today call Kush. We're going to deal with Benin, which is basically the southern half of modern-day Nigeria. We're going to deal with Munumutapa, which exists from about 1000 to about 1800, this massive empire here. So this is where the action is going to go next. Okay, Kush. You can see also on the Nile River, we've got places like Aswan, Dhaka, Kurusku, Semna, Kerma, Dongala, Kawa. The first capital city was at a site called Napata. Another important city was Nuri. Another important city was Musarrat. Another important city was Meroe. And I'm going to show you some of the artifacts that are part of this civilization. In 1832, a guy called G.A. Hoskins traveled across Sudan, and when he got there, he saw these pyramids and he sketched them, and he published them in 1832. Now, you see that there's some people in the picture giving us some idea of scale, and what's really interesting about the Sudanese pyramids is that there are 223 pyramids in Sudan. Now, there's 19 in Egypt. Therefore, there are more than twice as many pyramids in Sudan as there are in Egypt. Now, this is the site, Nuri, the first of the capitals of Kush. Now, ruling from Nuri, we get a very great king called Pharaoh Taharqa. Some people pronounce it Taharqa. Now, the same person's in the Bible where it's spelled Tirharqa, same person. Now, this particular person reigned between the years 690 BC and 664 BC. He's actually the most powerful black ruler in history. Unlike all previous rulers who called themselves Pharaoh of the Two Lands or Pharaoh of Kush, he crowned himself the Emperor of the world. He crowned himself the Emperor of the world. Now that sounds a big boast. Now what's the substance behind this boast? Right, this is taken from Professor Yusuf Ben Yochanan. His book is called Africa, Mother of Western Civilization. Now the details are wrong, but the sentiment is spot on. And this is where you can tell that Dr. Ben Yochanan has done more reading than everybody else. You can tell. Now, the empire of the Ethiopians wasn't this territory. Where the empire begins, it begins in Sudan, it includes Egypt, it went all the way to Carthage, all the way to Morocco, all the way to Spain. That makes sense? And then on this side, yes, it certainly went into Syria. So in other words, Pharaoh Taharqa ruled 1/3 of Africa. Never been done before, yes? Not only that, he ruled as far as Spain, he ruled here, making it quite clear that when he crowns himself as Emperor of the world, you'd better believe it, because who else is stepping like that? Now, we then have to deal with Carthage, because the Kushites set that civilization up. Now, what's really interesting about Carthage, now can you see that looks a little bit like Rome? Only one problem, it's older. So let's correct the facts. Rome looks a little bit like that. Right, now Carthage was founded in the year 814 BC. And it was founded by people coming in from the Middle East, black people coming in from the Middle East. But when Taharqa builds his empire, massive Kushite influence goes into there. So the deity Amen is worshipped there too. the deity Imhotep, who in this territory is called Eshmun. Right, same deity, Eshmun, Imhotep, the same person, was worshipped there. Massive numbers of Egyptian and Cushitic amulets and so on have been dug up on that site. Now, Carthage, for us dealing with our history, this is the greatest city in the ancient world. All products, be they animal, mineral, vegetable, all products from all over the world pass through Carthage. Carthaginian shipping was on all known seas. That makes sense? So we need to get with the fact being that even as late as the Carthaginian people, black people were still living fat. Then there's the greatest Carthaginian of them all. You enjoying that? Right, now I did some special research on this, so let me share some of this. There's some controversy in white circles over whether or not this is genuinely Hannibal, right? Right, so if anyone challenges you on this, this is what you're supposed to say. The documents tell us one fact about Hannibal. He rode the sole surviving Indian elephant. So that's what we're looking for. What kind of elephant is this? It's an Indian elephant. African elephants have a different shaped back. An African elephant's back curves in. The ears are much, much bigger. There's an apron hanging underneath the legs. Does that make sense? That is an Indian elephant. Now, once we know by Polybius and Livy that my man rode the sole surviving Indian elephant, it's that. Yeah? And if that's one side of the coin, then who's this? There it is. Right, now Carthage now becomes another center of civilization spreading culture. And it spreads culture to a civilization next door called Numidia. Now Numidia, it's hard, most people don't even know that civilization existed. Monument still standing, that's a sketch of a monument, but still there, monument still standing. Now we're going to return to Kush, because we need to get with some mundane artifacts like this, tweezers. Now, why am I showing you tweezers? You didn't come out here to hear about tweezers, now did you? Right, what material is that? Gold. Right, now have you got golden tweezers? Right, there it is. Now, the fact that you can have something as mundane as tweezers made out of gold, can you see, that's kicking. Yes. Right, now, in the 1820s, a guy called Giuseppe Fellini discovered the pyramid of Queen Mother Amarni-Shekheto. That's what the pyramid looked like when he got there. That's what the pyramid looks like now. In other words, what happened? They destroyed it. Now, having destroyed it, which is incidentally a model for what we should be doing to their monuments in Rome, right, this is what they found. You ready for this? Are you sitting down? No, people have to tell me they're ready. Yeah, we're ready. Right, enjoy that. Right, this is called the Treasures of Queen Mother Amarni-Shekheto. Now what you're looking at here is gold, gesso and glass worked together. Right then, now the Kushites, they came up with a new writing script, and the new writing script is called Meroitic. So just as we've got writing in ancient Tarseti, just as we've got writing in Egypt, just as we've got writing in Carthage, just as we've got writing in Numidia, you've now got a new writing script in Kush. Right then, just to show you some more monuments, this is still standing in Sudan, and it's at a site called Musarrat es-Sufra. And this is what Musarrat es-Sufra looked like when the Europeans first got there and visited it in 1832. Now that doesn't look very impressive, does it? Doesn't it look mash up to you? Yeah. Right, they surveyed the site, and check this out. We ready? This is the plan that they drew. Now, why this is important here is, can you see that we've got a temple complex here, a temple complex here, a temple complex there, a temple complex here, and a whole series of ramps and connections and so on. Now, can you see that's on the same scale as Karnak? Except this is not Egypt now, this is Sudan. Showing same ideas, people living large, people living fat. Now, just to reinforce the point, A. Hakem, this is General History of Africa, Volume 2, says, recent excavations at Meroe and Musarrat es-Sufra reveal temples with walls and statues covered with gold leaf. Could you imagine that? That means your walls are blinging. Not the people, the walls. Yes? Right then, this is another one of the Kushite structures. This is the palace of, another one of the queens. This is a queen's palace, and it's called the Palace of Wad Ben Naga. Now, let's look at the plan. How would you get into that room? Where's the doorway?
Underground.
Oh, no, there's no doorway. There's no doorway, so how do you get into that? Someone said underground. The other way of looking at it is overground. This is a multi-story building. And you can tell just from looking at the plans, how would you get into these rooms? The only way you can do is by stairs. That makes sense? So clearly then, this is a multi-story structure. The Palace of Wad Ben Naga. Right, then we have more pyramids. This is at a site called Jebel Barkal. And then here we see Kush's last great monument. And this is called the Kiosk. Now I'm going to show you one of the last dated artifacts from Kush, which brings the story to 300 AD. Now what's this? This is gold, gilt, and glass. And glass, exclamation mark, exclamation mark, exclamation mark. Right then, the action now is going to go to the Nigeria region. And this is what we're going to talk about now. We're going to talk about Nok, we're going to talk about Yoruba, particularly this place here, Ile Ife. And the real place where the energy is going to go is Benin. Yes? So this is where the argument is going next. Okay. In the year 1928, there was tin mining operations taking place in Nigeria that was led by the British. These tin mining operations resulted in certain places being dug up. And as places were being dug up, artifacts were being found. And then subsequent diggings found out that there was a civilization whose very beginnings goes back to, wait for it, 4,290 BC. Yes? Now, by the time we get to the period 1000 BC, we're starting to see brilliant art coming out like this. Now, this bust, we need to examine it because there's some very, very important points here. You'll notice here that the eyes almost like triangular, yeah? The mouth here is almost like a cube turned round. You can see similar geometric shapes here. Now, the idea of reducing the shape of a person to actual shapes, geometric shapes. Now, this is what would ordinarily be called modernism. Because this is where the cubists got the idea from that you could reduce a human being's shape into geometrical shapes. But this is modernism 1000 BC. You understand? Yeah. Meaning that modernist thought, abstract thought, Africans were dealing with this 1000 BC. And then the Europeans caught up with Picasso and Modigliani 100 years ago.
Of that civilization. But what's important is that when Kemet appears in the human record, it appears in 3100 BC with a fully developed civilization. Writing was already in place, astronomy was already in place, they already had the 365-day year calendar and 1 quarter for the leap year and all of that. That calendar had actually been put in place around 4236 BC. So we're talking about a fully developed, high technical civilization.
All right, well, let's talk about some of these technical advances. They knew that the Earth was round. What other concepts in mathematics are we talking about here?
Well, it's true. You certainly wouldn't want to determine the circumference of the Earth unless you had, of course, presupposed that the Earth was round. We want to point that out. All of the mathematics that we study today has its roots in Africa. We can start off simply with counting. The very first or the oldest known artifact in mathematics is the Ashango bone. That's over 8,000 years old. It's from the Congo. That's found in Africa. If we go ahead, they had developed fractions Furthermore, they had developed algebra and, of course, geometry, trigonometry, and had even gone as far as the roots of integral calculus. And this is all before Europe existed.
And we're going to be taking a look at some pictures, some slides in a few moments, but while they're getting those set up, what about the sciences? Beyond the mathematics, what other kinds of advances are we dealing with here? And Asa, you can jump right in.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is to know that the upper province of Kemet was referred to as Chem. That's spelled C-H-E-M.
Okay, why don't we take a look at that? We have a map of that. Go ahead, Sam.
And that's the root of the word chemistry. So that's an indication to us that the sciences of the earth were first studied there in Africa.
Okay.
Medicine as well.
Right.
The ancient Kemites were known throughout the ancient world as the best of all doctors. Homer tells us that, as do many of the Greek historians.
Sure. Asa, now, of course, I think a question that I have, and many people have is, how did they develop this? I mean, where did this knowledge come from?
Okay, the best, and we have to speculate on this, but some things we do know is that in Kemet, you had an unparalleled opportunity to be scientists. In other words, you have land that has regular cycles that work almost like clockwork. Every year the flood came at the same time, receded at the same time. You had a clear sky. You never had clouds. You had an unparalleled opportunity to observe stars. You had the need, for example, to develop mathematics in order to be able to lay out the land again and divide it among the people after the floods had receded. You had a religious orientation in Kemet whereby the people had a respect for nature through intensive study of nature. And having done that on the same spot, in other words, these were not nomadic people, they were sedentary people who had been on that same spot for thousands of years, which again gave them the opportunity to notice certain kinds of regularities in nature. So as from what we can determine, they spent a great deal of time in botany, in observing the stars, and observing the animals and so forth. So they had tremendous technical knowledge of all of these things, and out of that technical knowledge then flow the sciences, the arts, and literature.
And it is because African people understood the essence of who we are and what it takes to elevate our God consciousness that they were able to create 5,000 years ago things that cannot be duplicated today. And that power still exists within you right now.